I've got a bunch of questions that I've got to get through from you guys. It's the monthly Model Railroad Q&A. Let's get this thing started. My name's Jimmy. I'm drinking some breakfast blend coffee, and this is Coffee and Trains. This video is brought to you by Model Railroad Academy. Model Railroad Academy is your online resource for model railroad instructions, ideas, and information, with loads of tutorials and articles for model railroaders of every skill level. One of my personal favorites is Alan Keller's Great Model Railroads series. It is just so much fun to look at all of these different model railroads from all of these different great model railroaders and just get inspiration from those. Plus, you can find tutorials on everything from bench work to electronics to scenery, all sorts of things there. The first 1,000 people to sign up at the link in the description below will get a full year of premium membership to Model Railroad Academy for $1.49. Offer is valid for new members only. If you want to tell me what kind of coffee you're drinking and be featured just like these guys right here, you can do that in the comments below, and you might see your name pop up on an episode of Coffee and Trains. Also, this is the monthly Q&A, and at the end of this video, I'll tell you how you can get your question read on next month's Q&A. Cheers, guys. Just Wafik and Trains has 3 questions, actually. Their first question is, if I have a 70-inch by 28-inch table, which is actually about the size of this one right here, and what should I add to the layout? So what I would do in that situation is I would probably look at maybe a town that's a little off-center, some sort of scenic feature. It can just be like a pass through a forest or maybe going through a small tunnel, and then 2, maybe 3 industries, depending on their size. I think 3 industries is a good size for that particular layout if you're doing in scale. The second question is, should you make it a point-to-point or a continuous loop? So I'm going to refer you back to one of the model railroader greats, David Popp, and his layout that he built, his in-scale layout a long time ago in his basement. He started off as basically a hollow door layout, and it was a point-to-point that basically was a U shape on that hollow core door, but it also had a provision for continual running that he could open up a little tunnel that went through. So that's maybe a good way to go. And 3, you asked also, what is a good DCC sound decoder for a beginner? So DCC sound decoders for a beginner, what I would say is actually just, if you're just looking to get into it, buy them sound equipped. But if you're looking to get a DCC sound decoder that's going to be relatively easy to use, especially if you have something like JMRI or something that can adjust the CVs easily, Soundtracks and TCS are probably going to be your best bets, because the version that you buy, and make sure you buy the correct version for your locomotive, is going to have all the sounds that you need on it. You're not going to need another programmer like you would with Digitrax or ESU. So that's what I recommend, is Soundtracks or TCS. If you have in-scale, you're going to be a little bit limited. Soundtracks has limited in-scale selection, and TCS only does ones in like Bachman where they install it themselves, and you can't really buy a TCS in-scale decoder. But ESU and Digitrax are going to have plenty of those, but again, you're going to need that hardware like the PR4 for Digitrax or the Loc programmer for ESU. Those aren't particularly difficult to use. They're just, the PR4 is about $70 and the Loc programmer is about $150. So the reason I say to do the Soundtracks and TCS is that all the sounds are on there. All you need is a way is to choose the CVs for them. CJ Holland 48 says they're planning on making an in-scale T-Trak street runner module, and they don't know what to do to blend the street with the track, and he got any recommendations. So I have a couple ways that you can do this. One, Kato makes something called Unitram, and that is basically streetcar track that has a street on it. It may not be exactly what you need, but it's definitely something to look into. It'll connect to regular Unitrack, and if they have, I don't know if they have a version that can do the exact like length of a T-Trak module, but it's definitely worth looking at. If not, what I would recommend is styrene. Styrene is very easy to cut and fit in to make that street running look, and if you need to make a few adjustments, or if you mess up, you need to do another piece, you haven't put a bunch of plaster or anything all over the track, it's really easy to adjust. You'll just need to put some stuff to bring it up to level with the track. But that's the 2 ways that I would do it, is either a styrene sheet or the Kato Unitram system. Anthony Borden 2513 says, what's the best way to add sounds to the layout itself, like city sounds or other sound effects to the scenes automatically? Well, there's a couple different things you could do. The easiest way would be to, if you're willing to be more active with it or have a long sound file to play with it, just find a small Bluetooth speaker that you can adjust the volume at and just try to hide it somewhere. And then you can just play sounds off your phone or connect your computer or something like that. That's going to be the most dead simple way to do it. I know that there are some systems out there, but none of them are coming to mind. There's also little wave file sound cards that you can get on Amazon that are really dirt cheap that you just plug in a speaker to and it works. That may be another way to do it. And if you have a little bit of coding experience with Arduino and things like that, you can definitely look into using an Arduino to turn it off and on and things like that. So that's what I would do. Tazi says they're trying to restore an HO scale locomotive and they want to repaint it. Do you have any tips on how to properly tape off a locomotive and tape off curves? Well, you can actually get model masking tape. They do make that. I know when I go occasionally to Hobby Lobby to get supplies, they have it right there, but you can find model masking tape. If I can find some on Amazon, I'll put a link in the description below. Another thing that I would suggest, and I learned this from In Scale Dystopia when he did a little short on it, and that is using airbrush thinner as if you're going to airbrush. I do recommend airbrushing for this, but I would also say like use windshield wiper fluid as your airbrush thinner. It's not going to tint it blue or anything. I have painted multiple things now and it just works really well, especially when you're taping things off. I really recommend it. You're just going to want to get the mixture right and go for the same mixture that you have. Another thing is to use pre-mix things like Vallejo Air. That's another thing that you can use as well. Basically, you want to take as many variables out of the paint mix as possible. And if you're not comfortable mixing your own airbrush paints, go for something like Vallejo Air that's pre-mixed and ready for an airbrush. Thomas L. Durbin, he asked me if I'm going to get any of the NS Heritage units since I model that era, and also about the CSX ones. Well, I do have the Southern Heritage unit. I would like some more. I really like the Virginian paint scheme, and I like the New York Central one as well, but I do have the Southern one. And for CSX, I do have the Baltimore and Ohio. I'm really hoping that since Scale Trains has done a ton of work with CSX for paint schemes and that kind of stuff, and they've got the HO Scale Heritage paint schemes coming out, I hope that they come out with in-scale versions of CSX Heritage paint schemes, and Norfolk Southern for that matter. I know that they are working on a SD70, which is what some of the Heritage units are in Norfolk Southern, so it's just going to be a matter of what comes out, but I do know that they already have an ES44, and that's what several of the Norfolk Southern Heritage units are. That's what the Southern is right here. So, yes, I would like to do that. And you also ask, when is Jimmy's Trains coming back? That's my other YouTube channel, my smaller YouTube channel. It's probably going to come back when I get this phase of the layout complete so that I can do some nice longer videos. Because right now, if I do them, it's just going to be real quick around this area. But once I get this area done, it's going to be a lot. You're going to start seeing Jimmy's Trains coming back. Orlando Railfan Productions says their in-scale layout is made of 4 pieces of poster foam, and they have warped over time, and the layout has some bad grades now. What would you think that you could do? Well, it depends on what you can get underneath or around the foam. So there's a couple of options. You can try using some like Lawan plywood, that really thin 1/4 inch plywood, and sticking it in there to sure it up. And you can also try doing things like bamboo skewers, basically just anything you have just like to prop it up. And don't be afraid to cut into a little bit of your scenery and fix it back. A little bit of work every now and then is going to save you a lot of headache down the road. But yeah, I would definitely look into shoring it up with some wood. That's what I would do. Master Brendan 1990 asked about the DCC EX CSB1, which is their complete command and control system right out of the box, doesn't need to be built. And he asked, do I need any other parts besides that and DCC equipped engines in terms of Arduino parts, or is it all included? The only thing that you need is an appropriate power supply, which you can find on Amazon for dirt cheap. I'll link a couple of them in the description below. And that is really all you need. And then just make sure that you have the terminals hooked up properly, hook the program track and the main line, which is actually reversed on the CSB1. So you'll have to connect it to the other side. I think that's right. Let me double check. Had to look at mine down here. Yes, the one that's actually further away from the power plug is the one that is the main line. So it's reverse versus the standard L29N motor shield. But the Other thing that you asked about was considering RFID tags for your rolling stock under track to add animation and sounds, things like that. I have thought about that. The problem is I can't find ones that are really truly small enough so that I can use them within scale. If I was an HO scaler, I'd probably already be doing it. So, but it's something that I've definitely thought about that, and I maybe think about working on a project on that. We'll just have to see. Cart King Forever says they have a question about in-scale sound, and do I recommend purchasing DC locomotives and adding a decoder and sound yourself, or do you tend to lean towards locomotives that are DCC and sound pre-installed? Now, he does mention this in his question that the price difference is roughly negligible for purchasing a decoder versus buying it pre-installed. So here's basically what I have found. I have only bought one Kato in-scale sound locomotive, and that is my Kato Big Boy. The rest of them, I don't think I have sound in any of my Kato locomotives. And Kato locomotives, for the most part, are going to be bought DCC ready. They make the most DCC ready. I think they come DCC ready from the factory, and they just put decoders in them when they get here in the States because Kato's factory is in Japan. And so with Kato, I don't really install sound that much, though I may change that because they do have space if you want to put ESU decoders in. Digitrax has that capacitor that hangs off, which is a little weird, but ESU with the little dip in the back from the Kato chassis, it's pretty easy to put a speaker in there in the Kato ones. Scale trains, I have done both. I have installed sound in locomotives and I have bought factory sound locomotives. And I will say that the ones that I have that are factory installed sound, and these are using identical decoders, these are using ESU Loc-Sound 5 decoders from ESU, it's better from the factory. My two C39-8s, the Norfolk Southern one, I put in myself. It doesn't sound bad, but the factory installed one, the now Blue Ridge and Western locomotive, is factory installed, and it sounds just a lot better. And I've put my sound set up perfectly. I think it comes down to the settings. I've tried a bunch of different things. I just can't get it to sound as good. I'm using the exact speaker. I'm doing all of that. It just sounds better from the factory. So I don't know. Soundtracks or scale trains are fairly easy to convert to sound. They just have a couple pads that you solder the speakers on. You put the speaker in there. Yeah, for Atlas, I will say also that they have speakers in theirs a lot. But it's usually a little bit cheaper to get it pre-installed if you want sound versus doing it yourself, believe it or not. So, yeah, if you're looking for DCC and sound and in scale, I would definitely look at spending the money to get it factory installed, just because it's going to be, there's not really that much of a price difference. Unless you just want to do something like put a Digitrax decoder in there, which is going to be significantly cheaper. But a lot of times ESU and soundtracks and things like that are a higher quality than Digitrax sound. Jag11DSM says, do you play any kind of train sim games such as Train Sim World or Railroader? So I really want to, I just don't have time to game right now. But the really cool thing, I used to game a lot. And the really cool thing, though, is my kids are starting to approach the age where they game. So I think in the next year or so, I'm going to get them a Nintendo Switch. And I've built PCs before. I've built editing PCs, which is basically the same as building a gaming PC. There's just some slight differences. And I used to do a decent amount of gaming. I used to play a lot of World of Warships. I did Rolling Line on Steam, and I've played a couple of other Steam games. One of my favorites is Nebulous Fleet Command. But for train games, yes, I'm planning on getting back into that once my kids get to an age where they can enjoy more complex video games. So that's where I'm at right now, but I'm planning on getting to that. I'm just not there right now. Drew Debris 4631 says, do I have any tips on modeling a full-length subdivision in N-scale? The length is about 150 miles and has one diamond interchange. And so what I would say for this is have the main thing you want to model is where the train's going to be the most active, and that's going to be, it depends on your space first of all, but you're going to really want to model what's most active, so around your industries and junctions and things like that. A lot of times I've also seen diamonds, if you're not going to have like an actual train, like the diamond's just there for show and you're not going to have the other railroad coming through, you can just have the diamond go from the back of where your backdrop is and then go off your layout and then just have your actual line going through it. I've seen that plenty of times. But for modeling the entire 150 miles, for reference, this model's about 60 miles right here. What I would do is pick some specific areas that really represent what the scenery is like and put those in little compressed spaces in between your major concentrations of action. So, for instance, on my layout, the big turn right here is just kind of a representation of the woods that you're going to go through before you get to the first industries east of Elkin, North Carolina. And then this area back here is actually going to represent a couple different industries that are right along the Yadkin River. So that's what all that represents. So just try to do some spatial compression and represent and just pick and like concentrate what scenery is going to represent it. And then just focus on the areas of high action with your model railroad. Now this, of course, only applies if you want to do a lot of switching and action like that. If you want to just have something that runs through scenery, kind of do the opposite there. So, but yeah, just do small areas that represent the large empty spaces in between concentrations of train action. Michael Amoroso 4561 asks, is there a website that sells 3D files to download or for tractor trailer parts in InScale? I have not specifically looked for this yet, but the one website that I know that I would look at is Colts 3D. That's what I would look at. That's just kind of a general 3D marketplace for paid models. And if you're willing to pay a little bit for a model, you're going to get a lot wider variety than versus just the free models you're out there. And a lot of them aren't expensive. A lot of them are like $2, $3, $4. I think when I was selling 3D models, which I think I still technically am, it's like $5 or $10. And you can print as many as you want. So that is what I would do is Colts 3D and look for other websites like that. But there should be a website like that. Maybe it's something I can do. Shipwright 1918 asked a really interesting question. He said, if InScale had operating accessories like classic Lionel, would I have any, and what would you like to have? So I'm not sure. Like there are some that I would like to build. I think some of the loaders would be really interesting, but it also depends on what industry you're looking at. I think some things where you have the continuous motion and not the train triggered ones. So like you have stores that have displays with people moving inside them, or the firehouses with where the doors open and shut and things like that. I think that's what I would want to have. I think that the operating accessories for like the log loaders and the barrel loaders and the coal loaders and all that kind of stuff, I'm not sure if I would want that. I think InScale is just a little too small for that. And a lot of times the industries that I'm modeling I'm gonna want them to look a little bit more realistic. But in terms of like city scenes and things like that, yeah, that would be fun. Dan Windybank says that he is from the UK and will eventually be moving to the US and started thinking about an HO layout. He got his first locomotive, a Walthers Conrail Jeep 9, really good little locomotive right there. But he's wondering if there's a way to search US railroads by era. So I know that in UK and Europe that they have a lot more defined eras than in the US. So here's the interesting thing about the US is that you can have a lot of different, you can have like a 50-year span of stuff that can fit on a certain era. So for instance, if it's 2025, you could have stuff running that would be legal to run all the way back to 1975. Today, I think 50 years is the cutoff for that. And also you can have rebuilds of old locomotives and things like that. A great example is that there is a short line near me called the Caldwell County Railroad that runs, I think they have two Jeep 16s, which are a modification of the Jeep 9 or Jeep 15. I can't remember which one it's a modification of, but it's got a slightly different hood. And those have been around forever. So a lot of the three main eras of U.S. railroading are steam, transition, and diesel. So really it's by looking by what railroad is there, because there's also been a lot of railroad consolidation. So short answer is it's very hard to figure out what exactly to run. But what I would do is there's a lot of resources to figure out when certain types of locomotives ran on what railroad. So I'd figure out what you want to model. So you got a Conrail right there. So I would look at what all Conrail ran and when. There's plenty of resources for that. There's plenty of photos for that. And that's where I would go. But the eras in the US are a bit more jumbled up because of that 50-year window, and there's been rebuilt locomotives, and you can find some pretty old locomotives still running out there today. Aiden S435 says, do I know if there's any in-scale models of Walt Disney World steam engine and steam train that are easily accessible in the US? I think there used to be one, but it's one of those really hard to find things, and they disappear fast on eBay, but they don't make it currently, so you would just have to be on the lookout. I feel like Lionel has the Disney rights right now, so we're probably not going to see much in scale, but I do know that I think Bachman used to make the Disney World steam train set, or at least the Disneyland one. I'm not sure if it's the Disney World one, because there is a difference. RF64 asks if there is a Bluetooth controller for in-scale locomotives right now, and is there an HO controller? And so right now there is not. The only real universal Bluetooth system out there right now, I know that Bachmann has their own system, and I'm just talking about US stuff. I know there's some other stuff in the European and UK markets. But for in-scale right now, the only game in town is, actually there is no game in town. The only game in town period for Universal is Blue Nami, and that's just HO scale and up. I would only assume that they're working on in-scale, but that's a lot to cram on an in-scale decoder, especially with how small they're getting with Next 18 and E24. So right now, there's not a Bluetooth controller to directly control the locomotives for in-scale, but there is Soundtrack's Blue Nami decoders that you can use in HO scale locomotives. Ernesto Castoza asked if I tried LCC on my layout, and I have not. It's something that I've always kind of wanted to try, but I'm just not quite sure. I need to do a little bit more research, because it's one of the few things that I'm like, okay, I understand layout, command, and control is what it stands for, but I still need to figure out exactly what it means. I know TCS makes it. I know that Jason's probably going to comment on this from the train freak, because he's all about LCC. But yeah, so it's one of those things that I'm not that up on. Occasionally I will go down a rabbit hole and look into it, but I really just got to figure out more about it before I can make a video on it. I wouldn't be confident making a video on it. Cedar Lake Railfanner says they have unballasted Atlas track, and they've secured it with a few dots of hot glue and are running it with freight trains for in-scale, and the cars keep derailing, and what should they do to fix this? So what I would do is probably honestly just start messing around and wiggling the track. If it's hot glue, that means you can probably pop it off and then re-glue it later. I would recommend probably if you're doing just regular track. I've used hot glue plenty for Kato Unitrack, but I don't use it necessarily for regular track, especially flex track and things like this, because it can just make things a little bit uneven. But yeah, I would just figure out the spots and look at them and see if they're a little uneven. Like, are they wiggly a little bit, or is it consistently the same spot, or is it just the track in general? Because then it might be a car issue. So is it consistently the same car that derails? So basically, you just need to do what's called a fault tree and just kind of eliminate possibilities until you figure out what it is, and then you can work towards the solution. Vintage Renewed asks if I think that modeling tourist railroads and museums is going to take off, and if you think it will change the NMRA. It said it's popular in England, and they are really good about making all manners of preserved locomotives, but in the US, manufacturers often skip museum and tourist railroad locomotives. So, well, I wouldn't say that that is necessarily the case, and I've got a few pieces right here that are kind of examples of that. So first of all, I did get my EMD Jeep 30, which is from the North Carolina Transportation Museum, number 2601. I got that in this week, and I've got it in an HO scale. I also, from Microtrains, picked this up at a train show. This is I believe it's, I forget what, it's like either the 200,000th or 2 millionth boxcar of Pullman. I can't remember exactly, but this car is at the North Carolina Transportation Museum. Let's see here, what else? You can get the Big Boy number 4014 in its modern excursion format. You can get that in several different scales. You can also get, let's see here, I've got my Reading T1, which is an excursion locomotive. I've got my UP excursion train set right here. So while it's probably not as prevalent as it is in the UK, there's still a lot of it out there, and there's a lot of people who want to buy these things. So it's probably more prevalent than you realize. The other thing is that when locomotives are restored, they're typically restored to exactly the way that they looked. So when you have a set of locomotives, like for instance at the Illinois Railway Museum, where you have things like, I believe you have the Nebraska Zephyr, which I have the set in its original, which looks exactly like the one there. I have the Chicago 400, which has a very similar set for what it is. It has a few of the cars there. So there is a lot more than you think. It's just that in US museums, they restore them to the way that they were. So you don't necessarily have to buy the museum specific one. A lot of times manufacturers will just make that one. Another great example is Norfolk and Western 611 Class J. There is the Santa Fe 3750. So I think for locomotives and excursion cars, a lot of times you're just buying the cars and you're using them, because a lot of times we're just restoring them to the way that they looked. For modeling the tourist railroads themselves, I'm not quite sure. The market is really in two camps, which is you have the hardcore operators and people that build their layouts to operate on, and then you have the people that just build nice layouts to run on that are freelanced and things like that. And then of course there's the in between with the proto lance and things like that. So it's really just a different market. There are plenty of tourist railroads to model, but a lot of them are using locomotives that have been around and have historical models and records. So you don't really have to make a specific version other than numbering it to get the right one. So there's a few different ones out there, but overall, a lot of times you can just find the model has been made and then just put it on the tourist railroad if you're modeling it. Chris Seamster asks, how do you handle your steam locos? Very carefully. Oh, I'm just kidding. I didn't drop it. In all seriousness, I do take a lot more care with my steam engines. I save every bit of packaging that they come in so that I can keep them in the cases as much as possible. When they're not running, they're in the cases. I have N scale, so it's even more fragile. So I just have to be super careful, and I'm mindful of the way that they are handled. Coltoon 1010 asks, what automatic switches do I use and what power source? So what I do is I have Kato Unitrack, and for any of my automatic switches, what I do is I have an Arduino set up. So I know just enough coding to be dangerous, and I will code in button pushing for going through an L298N motor driver that will just give a little burst of electricity and a certain polarization that will throw my Kato Unitrack switches. If I'm not doing Kato Unitrack, I'm either using a Caboose ground throw, or I am using a Tortoise switch machine. Caboose ground throw is a manual, by the way, so don't worry about that. But the Tortoise switch machine is something that I will use the same setup with the L298N motor driver, but I'll have it burst for about 2 seconds, and that's enough to throw it one way or the other. But typically, I'm just hooking up, DC 12 volts to these, so it's nothing really overly complicated. I'm not using track power or anything like that. If you have a question that you would like answered on next month's Coffee and Trains, go ahead and put that in the comments below, and you might see your question answered. I do ask you to get these questions in as fast as possible. I'm typically taking the first 20 questions now, and I need to get them in and get them scripted so that I can get them recorded in a timely fashion so that I have time to answer, get links, all those kind of things. So that's what I would do. Just get those questions in, put them in the comments below, and you might see your question pop up next month. Thank you all so much for watching. Until next time, I'm Jimmy from the DIY and Digital. Stay safe, be kind, drink some coffee, and happy railroading.